When crises, harm, or violence could be a possibility, pastoral counselors need to be prepared to provide optimal caregiving that will promote spiritual, psychological, and physical well-being. Pastoral counselors need to consult with ecclesial, religious, and legal counsel about whether they are mandated reporters in their state, and also whether their denominational code of conduct requires them to report their suspicions that children, teenagers, elders, and the disabled are being sexually, physically, psychologically abused or neglected. The purpose of these laws is to guarantee that an assessment of danger is done by those with appropriate expertise, like social workers and law enforcement officers, who can take, if necessary, action to ensure the safety of those who are vulnerable because of age or disability. When pastoral counselors discover that an adult care seeker is experiencing or has experienced violence, they can together review what options are available, like developing a safety plan that might involve a shelter or contacting a rape crisis center. While pastoral counselors need to encourage those at risk to seek safety, they must also respect care seekers' rights to decide for themselves what further action, if any, to take. When care seekers contact pastoral counselors while violence is occurring, for example, in the midst of an episode of intimate partner violence, pastoral counselors must call the police and not try to intervene themselves in what might be a dangerous situation. Another way pastoral counselors must attend to the safety of the care seeker is by asking questions about despair and suicide. When threat and harm is experienced in the midst of catastrophic events like natural disasters or violence within the community, what people need first and foremost is psychological first aid. Religious professionals can work with community leaders to provide practical help in order to stabilize children, teens, and adults, and help them assess their own and family coping abilities. Most survivors have immediate needs for practical help that activate their coping skills and resources rather than specialized psychological care. After the pastoral counselor has determined that the care seeker is physically safe from harm, the pastoral counselor and care seeker can together assess the disorganizing and chaotic effects of any acute grief, post-traumatic symptoms, or use of addictive compulsive ways of coping. With the care seeker, and perhaps with members of a caregiving team, the pastoral counselor can develop daily strategies for helping the care seeker cope with the seeker's psychological, spiritual, and relational responses to crisis. They can explore, for example, what will help the care seeker regain a sense of calm. Religious and spiritual practices like prayer, worship, religious rites and sacraments, reading sacred text, meditation, listening to music, may help the care seeker find moments of peace and the strength to engage in the daily routines necessary for life. When a care seeker can effectively use spiritual and religious practices to cope with stress during the acute stages of a crisis, such coping might become an ongoing source in maintaining and deepening a connection with God. Pastoral counselors cannot assume that all religious and spiritual practices are life-giving. Care seekers who have psychological tendencies to become obsessive in a crisis might use prayer in ways that actually increase their anxiety. someone who uses the practice of confession to reconnect with God because she feels a profound sense of guilt about having an abortion may continue to experience shame. In that case, she will need to explore how spiritual practices can alleviate shame rather than simply turning over and over to a sacrament that is not helping her reconnect with God. The acute effects of a crisis include a sense of disorganization and chaos, the overwhelming emotional reactions, and the debilitating physical impact on sleeping, eating, and working. If people seek help in the midst of a crisis, then pastoral counselors need to be able to sustain them until the acute effects of the crisis subside. When some sense of safety and equilibrium can be maintained, care seekers will be more ready to mourn the losses incurred in the crisis. Caregiving involves constructing meanings and practices that can deepen a sense of connection with God and the web of being that includes self and others. During this phase of care, pastoral and spiritual care will take many forms. The focus of pastoral and spiritual care at this point is on the religious and spiritual dimensions of coming to terms with change, and care should include many aspects of religious and spiritual life, individual spiritual practices, and for those part of religious communities, communal gatherings and worship, exploration of religious and spiritual meanings through study of sacred text, or faith-based discussion groups involving reading and reflecting on religious sources and norms of authority. These aspects of spiritual and religious life can help care seekers fully experience and explore the meaning of their suffering, experience a sense of God in this process, and become more deeply embedded in a web of being. The time it takes people to mourn varies from person to person and depends upon the severity of the loss or violence, whether there is a history of unmourned or traumatic losses, whether psychological vulnerabilities to depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illness are exacerbated, and whether there is family and communal support. Many people will need at least 1 year because on important anniversary dates, they will likely re-experience acute grief. When a year has passed, their emotional responses to reminders and anniversaries of the crisis are not as likely to be overwhelming. A person who has had time to grieve will feel sadness in response to reminders. Spiritual integration will foster a sense of connection with self, God, and what has been lost. When care seekers identify a lived theology triggered by fear, shame, guilt, anger, or disgust, and learn to be self-compassionate, they will be more likely to face up to the many ways they have hurt others. Fear, shame, and anger keep people inwardly focused, with less capacity to step into another's shoes and imagine their pain. Shame often gets in the way of people experiencing and responding to true guilt, because they remain fundamentally trapped in wanting to avoid further self-humiliation and hurt to the whole of their wounded global self. Pastoral counselors can become companions on this journey of spiritual integration and reparation, with communities of faith offering vital support. Regardless of whether those who have hurt others are able to become more compassionate, they need to be held accountable, especially in order to prevent further harm. Intimate partner violence and sexual abuse of children breaks promises of trust foundational to such partnerships and family life. Those responsible for violence will not change by simply becoming remorseful or seeking forgiveness. They need to go through a process of change involving accountability to behavioral health and social services professionals. Separation and supervised visits are usually required for parents and step-parents who have abused their children. Questions about whether a couple and family can live together again are only considered after counseling of various kinds, beginning with individual and group treatment for those who have offended. Pastoral counselors can play a sustaining role if they are able to function as members of a team. The liability is that they will be pressured to align with those who have offended. Pastoral counselors are sometimes enlisted by offenders to witness to their remorse, broker premature forgiveness, using religious rites, and push for couple or family reunification. Pastoral counselors need to be part of a treatment team that require accountability and long-term change through individual and group behavioral health counseling. The final phase of care is reconnecting with the goodness of life. Moments of experiencing the goodness of life often occur through a crisis or in the midst of acute stress. Such moments can instill hope in some future time when the heavy burden of suffering will lift temporarily or gradually over time. Researchers have begun to explore moments in counseling that are perceived by counselors and clients as sacred. Such moments have a quality of transcendence, boundlessness, and ultimacy. Such moments are often infused with feelings of awe, uplift, gratitude, reverence, fear, and dread. These emotions, particularly positive, spiritual emotions, have been linked to significant psychological, social, and physical benefits. When either the pastoral counselor or care seeker recognizes and identifies the religious and spiritual meaning of such moments are likely to become even more life-giving. Moments of experiencing goodness of life are especially vivid and empowering in the darkest moments of acute stress. Artistic language can often convey the beauty of these moments. Raymond Carver's story, A Small Good Thing, depicts such a moment. When parents, enraged by the accidental death of their son, encountered the baker who was pestering them with anonymous calls after they failed to pick up their son's birthday cake on the day he died. When the parents finally realize who has been making these calls, they drive to the bakery before the sun has risen. They storm in to confront the baker. After bearing the brunt of their rage, the baker coaxes them to sit down and eat some freshly baked bread and says, "Eating is a small, good thing in a time like this." This moment seems to have the sacred qualities and marks a pivotal turn for these grief-stricken parents when they can lament the loss of their son in ways that reconnect them with the goodness of life. Moments of connecting with the goodness of life can only accumulate when care seekers fully mourn their losses and face their experiences of violence. Indeed, a central goal of pastoral care is deepening this connection with the goodness of life and resisting and challenging all that threatens and destroys life. One of the roles of the pastoral counselor is to help the care seeker recognize and cherish such moments and find strategies to experience them increasingly through spiritual and religious practices, individually and within communities of faith.